A lonely black farmer bought a deaf girl, sold by her drunken father, then realized she could hear. And what happened next brought an entire town to its knees. Imagine a world where one act of courage flips an entire community upside down. Stay tuned to Black Voices to find out how. $20? Anyone give me $20 for this mute, yelled Jack Morrison, waving a bottle of cheap whiskey as he pulled on a rope tied to the wrist of a 19-year-old girl. The cattle auction was winding down at the Millerville market. But the crowd still huddled around the corral when this grotesque scene began to unfold under the scorching Texas sun. The girl stood motionless as a statue, her eyes downcast, her dirty brown hair partially covering a face that might have been pretty if it weren't marked by neglect. Her bare feet were covered in red dust, and her faded blue dress, torn at the knee, showed obvious signs of years of abuse. She did not react to her father's deafening shouts or the cruel laughter of the men around her, as if she existed in a completely separate world. She doesn't talk, she doesn't listen, but she works like a mule, continued Morrison, stumbling slightly and almost knocking over the bottle. She cooks, she cleans, and best of all, she's no trouble at all. You won't find a cheaper woman anywhere. What if the girl everyone mocked was hiding a secret that could destroy them all? Keep watching Black Voices to uncover the truth. Silas Washington watched the repugnant scene from the shadow of his leather hat, his jaw clenched in indignation. At 42, he knew well the bitter taste of prejudice. As one of the few prosperous black farmers in the region, he had earned his 300 acres of land with blood, sweat, and an iron determination that the local whites had never been able to break, no matter how hard they tried over the past 15 years. He had come to the market to buy a few head of cattle, not to witness this revolting display of how some human beings treated others as property. The irony was not lost on him. He, a descendant of slaves, watching someone literally try to sell a person. $15, shouted Tom Bradley from the hardware store, provoking more laughter from the crowd. At least a mare can pull a cart. She's not even worth that, sneered another man, spitting on the dusty ground. What kind of idiot would want something like that? A woman who can't even hear you when you yell at her. The crowd laughed heartily, as if watching a human being auctioned off was the most natural entertainment in the world. Morrison smiled broadly, revealing yellow rotten teeth, clearly pleased with the audience's reaction. Then something caught Silas's attention. The girl, who supposedly couldn't hear anything, had an almost imperceptible reaction when a child shouted loudly behind her. Just a slight movement of her shoulders, as if she had been startled for a fraction of a second before regaining control. Silas took a step forward, emerging from the shadows. His imposing presence, 6 feet tall, broad shoulders molded by years of hard work, made some of the men in the crowd turn and whisper among themselves. It was no secret that many there did not approve of a prosperous black man in their territory. For a moment, just a moment, the young woman looked up and met his gaze. There was no pleading in those green eyes, no desperation or tears. There was something far more disturbing and intriguing, a deep, almost supernatural calm, as if she knew exactly what was happening around her and had made peace with her fate, even though she supposedly couldn't hear a single word. $50. Silas's deep voice cut through the hot air like a sharp blade. The silence that followed was so thick and heavy that even the flies seemed to have stopped flying. Throats cleared, boots shifted nervously on the ground, and all eyes turned to the black farmer who had dared to interrupt their fun. Morrison blinked several times in quick succession, trying to process the astronomical offer. $50 was more money than he saw in 3 months of sporadic work. Sold, Morrison stammered, almost choking on the words as he held out his trembling hand. Sold to the gentleman there. The hesitation on the word gentleman did not go unnoticed by anyone, especially Silas, who was already accustomed to this kind of veiled disrespect. He approached calmly and began counting the gold coins one by one, making sure everyone saw that he had plenty of money. As Silas counted the coins, something extraordinary happened. The girl, who was supposedly deaf, turned her head slightly when a cart creaked softly behind her, a sound most people wouldn't even notice. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Silas was watching and definitely noticed. He untied the rope from her wrist carefully, his calloused fingers avoiding the purple and yellow bruises around her battered skin. The knot had been tied so tightly that it had left deep marks. "What's your name?" Silas asked quietly, testing a theory that was beginning to form in his mind. She didn't answer verbally, keeping her eyes down, but for the first time that day, a ghost of a smile crossed her pale lips when he reached out to help her up into the wagon. A smile so subtle it could have been imagination, but it was there. As they walked away from that crowd of vultures disguised as civilized people, their hostile glances burning his back, Silas realized that this mysterious young woman held secrets far greater and more complex than any of those idiots could imagine. If you're loving this story about how prejudice can turn against those who practice it, don't forget to subscribe to Black Voices. What none of them knew, not Morrison, not the crowd, not even Silas himself yet, was that this seemingly impulsive purchase was about to set off a series of events that would shake the rotten and hypocritical foundations of that community forever. The trip back to the farm was silent, but not the uncomfortable kind. It was the silence of two people who understood the weight of unspoken words. Silas drove the wagon along the dusty Texas roads, occasionally looking back to check how the young woman was adjusting to the vehicle's uneven ride. Her name was Rose. He discovered this when she wrote it in the dust covering the side of the wagon, using her index finger with precise, elegant movements that contrasted with her neglected appearance. It wasn't the kind of handwriting someone would learn without formal education, and this sparked the first of many questions in Silas's mind. In the days that followed, the routine at the Washington farm took on a whole new dynamic. Rose worked with a quiet efficiency that impressed even Silas, who was accustomed to years of solitude and self-sufficiency. She cleaned, cooked, and cared for the animals as if she had been born to do so. But there was something else, an almost supernatural intuition that made her know exactly what needed to be done before she was even asked. It was on the third morning that Silas had his first real confirmation that Rose was hiding something. He was repairing a fence on the opposite side of the property when he heard the sound of approaching hooves. 3 men on horseback, Tom Bradley from the hardware store, Sheriff Patterson, and a third man he didn't recognize immediately. "Washington," Bradley shouted, still a considerable distance away. "We need to talk." Across the field, Silas saw Rose raise her head instantly, even though she was more than 200 yards away and supposedly deaf. She dropped the feed she was distributing to the chickens and ran into the house, moving with the urgency of someone who had definitely heard something she shouldn't have been able to hear. Silas finished hammering the nail into the wood before turning to face the uninvited visitors. Sheriff Patterson was a burly man in his 50s, known for turning a blind eye to certain injustices when they involved the right kind of people. The third man Silas now recognized as Reverend Mitchell, leader of the local Methodist church and self-appointed guardian of the community's morality. "What can I do for you?" Silas asked, keeping his tone respectful but not obsequious. "We've been receiving some concerns," the Reverend began, dismounting from his horse with calculated movements, "about this girl you've brought home. Some people in town are questioning whether it's appropriate for a single man of your condition to be harboring a young white woman like this." The word condition was delivered with a deliberate pause that turned a description into an insult. Silas felt the familiar burn of controlled anger rising in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "Rose works here in exchange for room and board," he replied calmly, "just like any other farmhand." "I don't see a problem with that." Bradley spat on the ground, a gesture that seemed to be his trademark. "Farmhand? She's a young woman, Washington, and you know very well what kind of rumors that can generate, especially considering your situation." Sheriff Patterson cleared his throat, assuming his official role. "I'm not saying you've done anything wrong, Silas, but you understand how some people might misinterpret this situation. A prosperous black man, a white orphan girl. You know how things work around here." Silas knew very well how things worked. He had spent the last 15 years navigating the treacherous waters of prejudice disguised as moral concern. He knew that his prosperity was already a thorn in the side of many of the local whites, and that taking Rose in would give them the excuse they were looking for. "We'd like to talk to the girl," the Reverend declared, "just to make sure she's being taken care of." "She's deaf," Silas reminded him. "And mute. I don't know how you intend to talk to her." Still, Patterson insisted, "It's our duty to check." Then something interesting happened. Rose appeared on the porch of the house, wearing a clean apron and carrying a tray with fresh water and cookies. She walked toward the group with measured steps, keeping her eyes down in a perfect performance of expected submission. When she reached the men, she gave a small, respectful curtsy and offered the tray, as if demonstrating exactly the kind of appropriate behavior they expected to see. But Silas noticed something the others missed, a small, mischievous smile playing at the corner of her mouth when she thought no one was looking. "See," Silas said. "She's well cared for and behaves properly." Reverend Mitchell took a cookie and bit into it, clearly impressed by the quality. "She's a good cook," he admitted reluctantly. Throughout the interaction, Rose kept up the act perfectly. She didn't react when Bradley deliberately dropped his water mug to test if she would hear the noise. She didn't move when the sheriff clapped his hands right behind her head. For all intents and purposes, she looked exactly what she was supposed to be, a young deaf-mute girl, grateful to have found a safe home. But Silas was paying attention to details the others overlooked. When one of the horses whinnied softly behind her, Rose adjusted her stance slightly. When Patterson muttered something about keeping an eye on the situation, she tensed her shoulder muscles almost imperceptibly. After the men left, carrying with them their thinly veiled disapproval and promises of future checks, Silas and Rose were left alone on the porch. She continued collecting the mugs in silence, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. "They'll be back," Silas said quietly, more to himself than to her. Rose stopped collecting mugs and looked him straight in the eye for the first time since she had arrived at the farm. For a brief moment, the entire facade of vulnerability disappeared, revealing a sharp intelligence and a determination that made Silas realize he had completely underestimated who she really was. That night, as the wind whispered through the wheat fields and the stars shone over the vastness of Texas, Silas began to understand that Rose wasn't just a victim he had saved. Every new humiliation from the town, every look of contempt, every malicious whisper only fueled something powerful growing between them, a silent strength that her oppressors couldn't see or understand. What those privileged, prejudiced people didn't know was that every act of contempt, every attempt at intimidation, was writing their own sentence of defeat. For a moment, when Rose bowed her head before the hostile visitors, everyone thought their suspicions about her place in the social hierarchy had been confirmed. But those who know true strength know that it grows in silence, fed by injustice, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its true nature. In the 2 weeks following the visit of the guardians of morality, life on the Washington farm took on a seemingly normal rhythm. But Silas began to notice details that left him increasingly intrigued. Rose wasn't just a traumatized young woman pretending to be deaf. She was orchestrating something much more complex and intelligent. The first clue came on a rainy morning. Silas was repairing the barn roof when he heard Rose talking softly to the horses. These weren't just affectionate murmurs, but clear, articulate words. "Calm down, Thunder. I know your hind leg hurts. We'll take care of it this afternoon." When he climbed down the ladder, Rose was back in her role as the mute young woman, feeding the chickens as if nothing had happened. But this time, when their eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she made an almost imperceptible gesture with her head, a small nod that clearly said, "I know you know." The definitive confirmation came in the form of Dr. Samuel Matthews, the only black doctor in the region, who appeared at the farm one Thursday afternoon carrying his medical bag and an enigmatic smile. "Silas," he greeted him, dismounting from his horse with elegant movements. "I came to check on your guest. I heard she has special needs." Dr. Matthews was a refined man in his 50s, a graduate of Howard University, and respected even by the most prejudiced whites in the area. After all, his medical skills were indispensable when their own lives were at stake. But there was something in his tone that suggested this was no ordinary medical visit. Rose appeared on the porch, drying her hands on her apron, and for the first time since he had arrived at the farm, Silas saw her smile genuinely. Not the restrained, cautious smile she showed others, but a smile of recognition and complicity. "Dr. Matthews," she said in a clear, polite voice that made Silas choke on the coffee he was drinking. "It's good to see you again." "Again?" Silas repeated, looking between the two of them. Dr. Matthews chuckled softly. "Silas, I'd like you to meet Rose Elizabeth Thornton, a graduate of Boston University in medicine and psychology, daughter of the late Dr. Jonathan Thornton, a pioneer in the treatment of mental illness." Silas's world literally stopped. Rose, or rather Rose Elizabeth Thornton, was a medical doctor. The young deaf-mute woman he had saved at the auction was, in fact, one of the most educated women in the state of Texas. My father lost everything in a fraudulent financial deal 2 years ago, Rose explained, her voice now carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding complex situations. When he died, my stepfather, Jack Morrison, saw me as an inconvenient burden. It was easier to present me as disabled than to admit he had a stepdaughter who was more educated than most of the men in town. Dr. Matthews nodded gravely. Rose came to me 3 months ago when she learned that I treated black and white patients alike. She had a bold plan to expose the hypocrisy of this community, but she needed the right setting. And I provided that setting, Silas muttered, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. You provided much more than that, Rose said, moving closer to him. You provided credibility, protection, and, most importantly, a living example that character and dignity have no color. But we needed time to gather evidence. Evidence. The word echoed in Silas's mind as Rose led him into the house. On the kitchen table, she had spread out dozens of documents, photographs, and meticulously organized notes. During these past 2 weeks, while pretending to be a mute, defenseless young woman, I have systematically documented the behavior of the respectable citizens of this town, Rose explained, pointing to different sections of the material. Tom Bradley selling defective tools to black farmers at inflated prices. Sheriff Patterson taking bribes to ignore crimes against farm workers. Reverend Mitchell embezzling money from church donations. Dr. Matthews picked up a specific folder. And this is the masterpiece. Rose discovered that the same group of men who came here to question the morality of the situation runs a scheme to exploit migrant workers that would be considered slavery in any decent court. Silas examined the documents with growing admiration and disbelief, secretly taken photographs, copies of fraudulent contracts, statements from victims Rose had convinced to speak out, all laying out a web of corruption and prejudice that went far beyond anything he had imagined. How did you get all this? Silas asked. Rose smiled, this time with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. When people think you're deaf and dumb, they speak freely in front of you. When they think you're defenseless, they let their guard down completely. And when a prosperous black farmer bothers them so much that they have to invent moral pretexts to bother him, they reveal their true natures. Dr. Matthews closed the folder with a satisfied click. The plan is simple. Next Sunday, during Reverend Mitchell's sermon, when all of good society is gathered, we will present a little educational exhibition. And if that doesn't work, asked Silas, though he already knew the answer from the determined gleam in Rose's eyes. Then, she said, arranging the documents with precise movements, we'll move on to Plan B. And believe me, Silas, they're not going to like Plan B one bit. That night, as Dr. Matthews left with copies of the documents to take to safe places, Silas and Rose sat on the porch watching the stars. For the first time since he had met her, he saw her completely, not as the victim he thought he had saved, nor as the mysterious young woman who intrigued him, but as the force of nature she truly was. Why didn't you tell me from the start? He asked. Because, Rose replied, you needed to believe you were saving me so that your protection would be genuine. And I needed to see if you were the man I hoped you were, a man of enough integrity to defend a stranger without expecting anything in return. And now? Rose turned to him, her eyes shining with an intensity that made Silas realize he had completely underestimated not only her abilities but the depth of her determination. Now, she said, we're going to show this town what happens when they underestimate both a prosperous black farmer and a woman they judge too weak to be a threat. It was when everyone laughed at the poor deaf girl that something extraordinary began to take shape. Not just in the documents scattered across the table, but mainly in the determined look that now shone in Rose's eyes with an intensity that would make those hypocrites realize that something devastating was about to destroy the small, corrupt world they had built with lies and prejudice. Sunday arrived with a clear blue sky. The Millerville Methodist Church had never seen so many people. The entire white elite of the town was present for Reverend Mitchell's special sermon on morality and social order. Rose entered the church as planned, wearing a simple dress and keeping her eyes down, perfectly playing the role of the submissive young deaf girl. Silas accompanied her, ignoring the hostile glances that followed them to the back pew. Reverend Mitchell stepped up to the pulpit with characteristic arrogance. My dear brothers, he began in a honeyed voice, today we will talk about how God establishes natural hierarchies in our society. Just then, Dr. Matthews entered through the side door, carrying a bulky briefcase and walking directly toward the altar. Reverend Mitchell, he interrupted, I believe the congregation will be interested in what I have to say about natural hierarchies. Rose rose slowly, and for the first time since she had arrived in town, her posture changed completely. When she spoke, her clear voice echoed throughout the church like thunder. My name is Dr. Rose Elizabeth Thornton, M.D., Boston University. For 3 weeks, while you treated me as deaf and helpless, I systematically documented the network of corruption you have built in this town. The silence was absolute. Tom Bradley stammered in disbelief. But, you're mute. No, Rose smiled. You just never bothered to listen. Dr. Matthews spread documents across the altar. Tom Bradley, selling defective tools to black farmers at 300% above cost, offering discounts to white customers. Bradley turned pale. That's a lie. We have your own notes, continued Dr. Matthews, documenting different prices for different types of customers. Sheriff Patterson tried to leave, but Rose raised her voice. Sheriff Patterson, would you like to hear about the $12,000 in bribes you took to ignore labor violations? Patterson froze as if he had been shot. You can't prove anything. I can, Rose smiled, pulling a device from her bag. Did you believe that a young deaf woman couldn't use a camera or a tape recorder? The congregation exploded in murmurs as Rose continued. Reverend Mitchell, your misappropriation of donations totals $4,000 this year alone. Money from orphans and widows financing your mission trips to the Houston casino. The Reverend tried to regain control. This is the house of God. The house of God, interrupted Silas, should be a place of truth, not a den of hypocrites. Rose walked to the center. But most striking is the forced labor scheme you coordinate. Workers trapped in debt, documents confiscated, wages withheld, modern slavery 15 miles from a church that preaches freedom. The devastation on the faces of the three men was complete. Dr. Matthews held up one last document. Copies of all the evidence are being sent simultaneously to the State Attorney General, the Austin newspaper, and the Federal Investigation Office. Panic was instantaneous. Bradley tried to run, but Silas blocked his way. Rose looked at the silent congregation. For 3 weeks, you saw me as weak and flawed. Today, you discover that I am more educated than your children, richer than your husbands, and definitely more moral than your leaders. The Reverend made one last attempt. Even if these accusations. They are not accusations, Rose cut him off coldly. They are facts that will be presented in court next week. As the revelations piled up and the masks fell, one question remained in the air that would forever change not only the lives of those exposed hypocrites but the entire power structure of a town that had grown accustomed to oppressing those who were different. Because when the truth finally explodes, it rebuilds entire realities. And not even the most powerful can control what is born from the rubble of their own arrogance. 6 months later, Millville's transformation was so dramatic that visitors from neighboring towns came specifically to witness what happens when justice finally prevails over hypocrisy. Tom Bradley had lost his hardware store after the scandal. With no customers and lawsuits piling up, he was forced to sell everything for a fraction of its value and leave town. The last time anyone saw him, he was working as a farmhand 3 states away, earning exactly the same wage he used to pay the workers he exploited. Former Sheriff Patterson was serving time in a state prison for corruption and abuse of power. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who used to arrest farm workers for made-up crimes was now sharing a cell with some of them. His former prisoners were generous enough to explain to him personally how it felt to be treated unjustly. Reverend Mitchell had been expelled from the Methodist Church and blacklisted by every denomination in the region. His latest attempt to start over was cut short when a small-town congregation discovered his history through newspapers that still carried his photo. He now survived by selling insurance door to door, experiencing for the first time in his life the constant rejection he had imposed on others. Meanwhile, the Washington farm had become something completely different. Rose had established a free medical clinic there that served farm workers regardless of color or origin. Her reputation as a competent and fair doctor attracted patients from 3 neighboring counties. Dr. Matthews became a partner in the clinic, and together they created a medical education program for young people in the area who would never have had the opportunity to study medicine. The first class included 5 black students, 3 Latinos, and 2 women, a composition that would have been unthinkable in the old Millville. Silas discovered that his farm was perfect for growing the medicinal herbs Rose used in her treatments. The operation grew so large that he had to hire 12 permanent employees, all receiving fair wages and a share of the profits. Tom Bradley would have had a fit if he had known that a black farmer now employed more people than any other business in the region. The Methodist Church, under new leadership, officially invited Rose and Silas to marry in a ceremony attended by more than 300 people. The congregation that had once whispered about the immorality of the situation now celebrated one of the most respected couples in the community. During the ceremony, Rose made a point of speaking in her clear, educated voice about forgiveness and second chances. "Some people in this town judged me without knowing me," she said, looking directly at the faces in the crowd that had once despised her. "But I choose to believe that people can change when they are confronted with the truth about themselves." The most symbolic moment came when Millerville's new mayor, a black woman elected with 80% of the vote, presented Rose and Silas with the honorary key to the city. The same town that had once questioned whether they had a right to exist in the same space now recognized them as its most valued citizens. 3 years later, when journalists visited Millerville to write about the town's miraculous transformation, they always asked Rose what the secret was. Her answer never varied. Never underestimate a person based on what you think you know about her. And never confuse silence with ignorance or kindness with weakness. Silas, now the father of 2 adopted children and owner of the most prosperous farm in the region, used to add with a smile, "And remember, sometimes the person you're trying to oppress may have more education, more intelligence, and definitely more character than you ever dreamed of having." The story of Rose and Silas proves that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so beautiful and prosperous that they spend the rest of their lives regretting that they didn't recognize your greatness from the start. Prejudice is a prison that imprisons both the oppressor and the oppressed, but only one of them has the key to get out. If this story of how love and justice can transform even the hardest of hearts has touched you, subscribe to Black Voices and share in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone was judged unfairly because of their appearance or condition? Sometimes the most extraordinary people come in the most unexpected packages.